So there has been no shortage of controversy when it comes to all things COVID. And one of the big things recently that's getting attention is how Christians are handling COVID and how maybe we should have been a little bit more skeptical of some of the government talking heads and particularly Francis Collins and how he addressed COVID. So I want to talk with Megan Basham. She has an article up at Faithwire, or not Faithwire, at the Daily Wire, talking about COVID-19 and particularly Francis Collins. So Megan, can you tell us a little bit about just the crux of your article and your central argument in it?
Well, really, the crux of my article was that Francis Collins, as the head of the National Institutes of Health and a public Christian, he was very much platformed by all of the establishment organisms within evangelicalism, within Orthodox Christianity. We saw him really partnering with just about every sort of marquee pastor you could imagine. He did some webinars with Tim Keller, with Russell Moore, with Rick Warren, with N.T. Wright, just a lot of people. Ed Stetzer, Christianity Today. And in all of those meetings and all of those interviews, all of those webinars, he really pushed one very specific message, which was the conventional government wisdom regarding COVID, things like lockdowns, masks, vaccinations, and then very specifically also dismissing the lab leak theory as a conspiracy and warning that that's something Christians shouldn't indulge in. And all of these messages were picked up by these faith leaders and amplified. So when I started working on my reporting, one, I looked at the fact that, look, all of these things were not as cut and dried as they were presented on these programs, in these interviews. And then secondly, looking at Francis Collins's record and going, as he's being presented as somebody who is a champion of human life and a brother in Christ, I'm not questioning his salvation, but as far as his values and his ethics as a Christian, would they align with most of the people he was speaking to and the church members he was appealing to? And ultimately, my answer was no. I think a lot of people would find his record and his public policy positions pretty upsetting and certainly not in line with their own views.
Yeah. So let me ask you this question about it, because it is interesting to sort of see how you broke down all of those perspectives and the things he was doing as the head of NIH, the things he was funding. What were some of the most shocking elements that you personally uncovered as you were kind of going through that record?
Well, one of the top ones was the funding that he's given to fetal tissue research. Now, there was some argument that as the head of the NIH, I'm kind of a person who says, look, the buck stops with the leader, that perhaps he did not know some of the details of some of this research. However, Francis Collins has been very much on record as being pro stem cell research, pro fetal tissue research. So this kind of experimentation went in line with that. And to give you one example, millions of dollars went to the University of Pittsburgh to harvest organs from full-term aborted babies. We're talking 40, 42 weeks, so full-term infants here. And also the kind of research that took infant scalps and grafted them onto lab rats. There have been charges, something I'm looking into now, from other medical doctors saying that some of this research involved organs, kidneys, ureters, that could only have been extracted from still living infants. So that would be one example of the fetal tissue type research. And then on the other side of the coin, he has been very instrumental in furthering an initiative that diverts funds to the health research of sexual and gender minorities. So when you hear that, what you should hear is like the LGBT movement, the trans movement. So one of those initiatives was to give grant funding to research that distributes opposite sex hormones to children as young as 8 and mastectomies to girls as young as 13. So definitely some kind of experimentation, some research that most Christians would find pretty alarming.
Megan, what was the reaction, and what has the reaction been to this piece since you put it out? I mean, I've seen a lot of reactions, so obviously you have a clearer view of what's happening in all of your responses. So what has been the biggest response to your piece?
Well, what's been interesting is that I have not had much of a direct response. I talked about in the piece reaching out to some of the Christian leaders that I named in the story just to find out from them. Have you had any second thoughts? Have you reconsidered how you framed Francis Collins as a Christian of great integrity, a man you can trust? Have you had any reconsiderations of that? None of them directly responded to me, but I have gotten some sort of back channel responses through other Christians and conservatives. One would be Eric Erickson, the conservative radio host who's taken over Rush Limbaugh's time slot. I like Eric, and he wrote an essay saying, look, I was very concerned about the issues Basham brought up, but I went and spoke to some of the men she named in her article. Now, he didn't say specifically who he spoke to. He just said, I spoke to some people and they're good guys. It's okay. The issue is more complex than it appears at first on the surface. And then that article sort of finished by saying that he's very concerned about divisiveness and disagreement and really tone, a disagreeable, divisive tone. And I'm not sure what Eric's talking about, if it was directly in regards to me. I would say if you read my article, I was pretty straightforward. I didn't insult anyone or use any polemics. I documented everything very carefully, so it would be very fact-based, very just very well researched. And so I don't know if he was talking about me, but it was included in the article that was responding to me. And since then, I've just seen a lot of social media posts. A Gospel Coalition essay picked up on Erickson's essay and said the thing we really need to be concerned about here is divisive tone. So as a journalist, as a reporter, I feel a little frustrated with that response because I kind of went, look, I laid out some very concrete charges here, some things that I think need detailed answers. And I don't think really tone is the answer to what happened here.
Yeah, and I want to cite that the title of your piece is How the Federal Government Used Evangelical Leaders to Spread COVID Propaganda to Churches. And again, that's available over at the Daily Wire. I want to ask, after doing the research that you've done, spoken to the people that you've spoken to, I wonder what your take is on had Christian leaders, thought leaders, maybe held Collins to a greater level of account for his record. How might this look? How might this landscape have shaped differently than it has?
Well, two things. I think I wasn't saying that, look, we should not have listened to the National Institutes of Health director, someone who worked on the Human Genome Project. Certainly, he's a medical expert and his opinion is worth considering. But there is a difference between considering and presenting him as the authoritative voice. And that's what I think was missing, is that he was not only presented as the authoritative voice medically, but also almost from a spiritual perspective. He very much said, look, doing these things, wearing these masks, not meeting, getting vaccinated. And again, I'm not arguing against vaccination. I'm just saying, there are other considerations within the medical community. And he was saying that these things are gospel things. This is what loving your neighbor looks like. So personally, I would say that was sort of heaping a lot of legalism on people as we were still wrestling through these issues. And as we're still having a national conversation, even working out the medical truth of some of this, there has been a lot of debate since then. Even the CDC is backing off of this idea that cloth masks do much of anything. So one, I was fine with presenting Francis Collins as a medical expert. But if you're going to do that, I think you need to invite some other medical experts into that conversation, particularly if you're presenting it before churches and you're saying, church members, I want you to consider this in light of biblical values. What does the Bible tell us? So you shouldn't really just have one voice there because it's a very complex subject. And then the other thing was really just presenting him as someone who is an advocate for the sanctity of human life. I can just say quite boldly that I think most people would have some doubts about that given his public policy record. So I think that that's information that should have been carefully presented. And one more, and I'm done with this answer, but one more is that some of the things that some of these church leaders like Ed Stetzer repeated in a Christianity Today essay where he called the lab leak theory conspiracy, that essay disappeared. And it was just taken off of Christianity Today's website with no editorial note, no acknowledgement. And to me, journalistically, it's just not very ethical, and that's not how we should be operating. If we're going to be having these discussions, if you got something wrong, then you say so. Don't just erase it and pretend it didn't happen.
Well, certainly when you've taken a position like, Christianity Today has on Trump and other things, and you've been so vocal and open, acknowledging that at the least seems like the thing you should do. The one thing about your piece that really struck me the most, kind of walking back from it and looking at it, was that my assumption, and this is based on interacting and knowing some of these people, is that they probably didn't know the information in the piece about Collins. And if you look at the history of Collins back to 2007, he's sort of been presented as, here's this Christian scientist who bridges the gap. And my assumption is we just haven't really gotten that information out there. And so you did a really good job of, especially in the second half of the article, presenting that info. Now they know about it, but it does seem to point to a bigger issue. And I want you to react to this, especially if you disagree with it. But it seems like we've had this sort of tension of politics coming into the church. I mean, this sort of thing, obviously not on the pandemic necessarily, but under Trump with Evangelicals for Trump, I sat in on meetings. I mean, there were plenty of these gatherings and meetings where people were sort of told to come alongside with Trump. My thing is, I don't really care if either side is going to do that, but the smart thing for a pastor to do, it would seem based on your research, would be to really know and understand every piece of what that person is representing before they dive into that sort of endorsement.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think that maybe that's the lesson that we take away from all of this is, look, I'm not sure where it started, again, because they won't talk to me, but maybe there was a domino effect. Maybe one church leader, one pastor said, this is a really good guy, and introduced him around to other people, and questions just weren't asked. So you had the domino effect of everyone sort of going, I've been assured that this is an admirable, reliable voice in the church. So nobody really looked. So that's possible. And I think we saw things like that around the Trump administration as well. And maybe one of my frustrations is a couple people seem to dismiss my article as Trumpism somehow. And I'm certainly not I'm very careful as a journalist not to be too politically aligned, even though I am an open conservative.
Right.
So yes, I think that is wisdom there, that, we need to really be careful if we are going to get politically involved. At that point, then you have the responsibility to sort of heed the Proverbs admonition of, you better have a lot of counselors. You better be doing your research. And you better be allowing a lot of voices into that conversation because, look, the church in some ways is a captive audience. And government powers throughout history have wanted to make use of that captive audience and use their power to influence the church. So we always need to be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, and it's an interesting time now too as well, because in a lot of ways during COVID, Christians, particularly white evangelical Christians, have been sort of labeled the scapegoat and sort of the villain in all of this. So it seems like, to your guys' point there, I mean, you should be especially leery about walking alongside the government on this. And you brought it up earlier, and maybe we can dive in a little more to this idea of when does loving your neighbor equal obeying the government? What is that line there, and where does it stop? Because I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, I mean, and that for me was the first sort of alarm bell that went off that interested me in the topic. That it seemed like so many things that should fall under the umbrella of religious liberty were not being allowed to fall under that umbrella. We weren't leaving things up to individual consciences and, spirit prompting. We weren't leaving things up to individual church communities to say, for us, we've prayed about it and we've decided that it is important to obey Hebrews and meet. Instead, that was dismissed as very specifically with Francis Collins and Tim Keller, for example, the bad and ugly of good, bad, and ugly responses. And I went, there's a lot of judgment there. And I don't know that there's a very clear-cut biblical answer and rule about when churches should meet and should not in a pandemic. So that seemed to me like very much an issue where you leave that up to someone answering their own master.
Yeah, but you could shop at Walmart with no problem endlessly in long lines. Every time I walked into a Walmart, I was horrified by how many people, which is normally the case, were inside, but yet you couldn't go to your church.
Right. So, and and on the flip side, look, I didn't love it that if some churches we're going to be a little more cautious, I think, maybe you also need to go, we're going to leave that to them. But it was just such a round robin of accusation and judgment. But when it comes with the power of the federal government, then you've really got something different.
Yeah. Yeah. You wonder sometimes, like, because I remember some of the first images we saw during the lockdowns. What were, see if you guys have the same images. I'm remembering dozens of police cars showing up to a church. I think it was in somewhere in the South. It was like Mississippi or something like that. A big show of force with police going to a church. It was like to Billy's point, yeah, people were still going to the essentials like Walmart and whatnot, but churches were this like target. And you see John MacArthur's church out in California being made an example of. It seemed like the big example that a lot of governments, whether it be local or state, wanted to make examples out of were the churches.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it was that, originally when you first started to see that early on, you went, okay, maybe it really is about health measures. But as it drug on and you saw just ridiculous things like people being able to go clubbing and go to concerts and football games, but not church. And you went, okay, I think something different's happening here.
Yeah. Look, Megan, I want to ask too, because we're in this era with COVID in particular, over it's gone on for now 2 years. There's this sense of giving in to such incredible levels of cynicism. We assume that the motives of a person who thinks differently than us must be bad. Like we don't give anybody the benefit of the doubt anymore. I think a lot of that, there are many reasons for that. Some of that certainly is a hopelessness, I think, that the secular world is feeling right now, particularly in the midst of a pandemic. But I want to ask you as a reporter, I want to pivot a little bit. How have you kind of avoided giving in to complete cynicism, even if, of course, you have a healthy skepticism? How have you kind of guarded your faith through this process of not just reporting on COVID, but being in media in general?
Yeah. And I tend to be sort of, my husband is the light, shiny, happy person in our marriage. I'm more of the dark, suspicious one. So I do have to work on that. And, to be honest with you, the main way I do that is just to say really plugged into my own spiritual disciplines. Like when people say, I'm praying for you, I'm like, just pray for me that I carve out margins to be in the Word, to be in my Bible study time. When literally just last night, I went, I really feel like vegging and watching Boba Fett. But I'm going to listen to an Alistair Begg message instead, because I really need to feed more of that into my heart and soul as I'm working on this stuff than I need to feed more mass media in. So that's one way I do it.
Yeah.
Megan, we've noticed, I've noticed, I'm sort of new to reading some of your stuff, and I've seen you be a little outspoken on your faith. And so just wanted to, for our audience, just ask you if you don't mind sharing a little bit about just sort of your personal background and like kind of how you came to the faith.
Yeah. So it's funny. It wasn't something I talked about for a long time, and I don't know why, other than it just, people didn't seem that interested. And lately I've been getting the question a lot. So I grew up in a Christian home, but I myself was not a believer until really around 24. I went away to college. I was kind of the consummate prodigal. So I went off and wasted some years in loose living and whatnot at Arizona State. And through that process, I ended up in an English lit course where I was reading the Vulgate Cycle of Lancelot, and I've told this story in an essay in then Weekly Standard, and the Washington Examiner still has a copy of it, funnily enough. Someone sent it to me, where I just kind of talked about, I read this story of Lancelot where these monks would come out, these hermits, and would confront him about, his blessings that the Lord had heaped on him, that he was raised with an understanding of the faith, but he was squandering it all. And I felt so convicted from that. And it was pretty funny that here I am in this English lit class going, this is me. I'm Lancelot. So, and I'll just be really transparent. My life at that point was a mess. And I prayed, and I literally think I got down on my knees and said, Lord, help me. I had enough of those seeds planted in my childhood. And so when the moment came, I remembered how to go home. So since then, since about 24, I've been walking with the Lord and consistent in my faith. And it really just turned my life around. Met my husband at church, went back to church. And so that was the turning point for me.
It's great.
Yeah. It's an awesome story. And I think it's good to, particularly as believers, to see other Christians out in these industries, whether it's media or entertainment or, whatever, that you can be a Christian who is also in these spheres and making a difference. So Megan, I appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk with us. Again, the story is how the federal government used evangelical leaders to spread COVID propaganda to churches. That's over at thedailywire.com. Thank you, Megan Basham, for talking with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.